Europe's future, 83 years following the outbreak of World War II. The debate is taking place at the Museum of World War II in Poland's city of Gdańsk. And we're introducing our guests tonight. Professor Grzegorz Berendt, the director of the Museum of World War II. Welcome. Professor David Engels, historian, philosopher and lecturer at the Western Institute.
Hello, good evening.
Welcome to our debate. And Professor Gunnar Heinsohn, genocide researcher at the Rafał Lemkin Institute and also the first teacher of military demography at NATO Defense College. Welcome.
Welcome.
World War II was a pivotal moment for the history of Europe. The outbreak of war changed everything. It came fairly unexpectedly to some, to others perhaps not so, with countries conspiring to create the chaos that followed. Nazi Germany and the USSR have plunged Europe into a dark period, the effects of which can still be felt today. We will begin our debate by discussing the way the war broke out and also could it be avoided and how it influences the world of today. And we will start by playing a video that was prepared by TVP World in conjunction with the Polish National Foundation and forms part of the Unredeemed campaign. Let's look.
History may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. We are encouraged to learn the lessons of history, but we rarely succeed. As we commemorate the outbreak of the Second World War in Poland, we would do to remember these simple and timeless rules.
Poland's fate too often was dictated by others. This land was invaded and conquered, carved up and occupied.
In just over 4 years, 1 in 5 Polish citizens would be murdered at the hands of an evil ideology bent on racial conquest and authoritarian rule.
Poland was a young state still in 1939. Its neighbors, Germany and Soviet Russia, both sought to extinguish Poland. What about Poland's allies, Britain and France? After their bloodletting in the First World War, they wanted little part in Eastern European quarrels. They thought that Georgia was better than war. But dictators could be appeased by gifts of land at the expense of others, of course.
Today, Russia has strangled democracy, has sought to do so elsewhere, not only in his homeland. Under false claims of ethnic solidarity, it has invalidated neighboring nations.
History rhymes, after all. Pre-war German claims to territories are shadowed in Russian claims to even older conquests in modern Ukraine. France and Germany preferred to trade with Russia after 2014. They upheld the moral right of Ukraine, but business was business.
On the 83rd anniversary of World War II, Europe has once again found itself at a poignant moment, with war once again at its doorstep. We shall begin with a brief prologue of how World War II started. Professor Berendt, can you briefly explain how it actually came about? How was it that Europe has plunged into the bloodiest, most violent conflict in its history?
The most simple answer to your question is that in 1930s we had two political leaders who wanted war, both Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. We can even say that they dreamt about war for various reasons, but they were preparing their countries, their regimes for war. What was similar in these cities? In 1920s and at the beginning of 1930s, Joseph Stalin cleansed the political stage in the Soviet Union, and there was nobody in that country to stop the war. And the doctrine of the Soviet Union was to spread the revolution all over Europe, all over the world. It was a dream of the communists from the very beginning. So they were going to war all the time. In the Soviet Union, they were simply preparing themselves for war from 1920s. They dreamt about revolution at the beginning of 1920s, but they failed during first years after the First World War. On the other hand, in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler at first was forced to remove political opposition, and he succeeded with this. Then he was to build a military infrastructure, or to rebuild military infrastructure. And only after doing it, he found himself and his state ready for war. Both totalitarian states ready for war, and democratic Europe unable to stop both Hitler and Joseph Stalin.
So two revisionist powers bent on destroying the foundations of the system of security of the continent at the time. Professor Engels, do you think that this could have been stopped if it wasn't, not only for the fact that these two powers were really focused on essentially creating this sort of confrontational situation where war was inevitable, but also could it have been stopped if we actually had a more determined position, a more determined stance taken by other powers on the European continent and perhaps beyond?
Of course, counterfactual history is always difficult to describe, but it is sure that a more determinate attitude of the Western powers would, of course, have been very helpful in either making impossible the eruption of the Second World War in 1939, or at least, if it had erupted, then if a reaction would have been very quickly from the side of France, for example, or also from Great Britain, then, of course, Nazi Germany would have much more difficulties in focusing all its attention on Poland. Today, we know, of course, that the German army in 1939 was all but well prepared. We know that the Panzer forces were still very embryonic, that the French forces were by far superior, and so that the decided attack of France on Germany would have very quickly brought Nazi Germany to crumble down. So obviously, indeed, a much more decided attitude would have made possible another outcome. Now, I don't think that it would have been possible to make or to avoid entirely a Second World War. I think that given the conflict potential between the expansionism of the Soviet Union, between also the resentment of post-Versailles Germany, and also, of course, the very unsettled situation in different frontier regions, not only in Poland, but also Yugoslavia and Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary, it was sure that it would have been very difficult to find a peaceful solution. But to see that this situation would have emerged into a 6-year-long world war, that would have been made, I think, absolutely impossible by a more decided Western policy.
Some commentators say it is much easier to start a war than to stop it. And in fact, once the global order was thrown into disarray, it was very difficult to do something about it, apart from, of course, defeating the main perpetrator, which was Nazi Germany. But in fact, when we discuss that, we often forget that there were two perpetrators. Now, Professor Heinsohn, do you think that if Germany was stopped at the moment, could World War II still have happened because of the revisionist stance of the Soviet Union?
What was new? In the First World War, 8 million young Europeans killed each other. And still, they obeyed the laws of war. They obeyed the Hague Convention that had defined the killing of civilians an international crime. There was one exception. In 1915, when Turkey began the genocide against the Armenians, that was not called genocide in 1914 because the Polish lawyer Rafał Lemkin coined the term in 1944. When the Turks started this genocide, Petersburg, London, and Paris called it crimes against humanity using the terminology of the Hague Convention and promised to bring the perpetrators to justice. Berlin and Vienna, they obeyed the rules of law in Europe, kept silent. Why? Prussian generals commanded many of the Turkish armies. They reported every detail of the genocide to Berlin. Nobody was better informed. But the emperor decided, he was a friend of the Sultan, not to speak about it. So by this, the Germans became a silent collaborator in a genocide. The Second World War was different because it started right away with 2 genocides against the Polish people by the Germans and by the Russians. The Germans with Intelligenzaktion and AB-Aktion, that was meant to kill all educated Poles and turn the rest into slaves for German settlers. But now there was resistance. The chief of military intelligence in Germany, Canaris, he started his resistance because wegen der Morde in Poland, because of the assassinations in Poland. And he said in December 39, whatever battle we will still win. We lost the war because of the crimes against Poland. We cut ourselves out of civilization because of the crimes against Poland. So this was a complete difference between these 2 wars on the same territory of Europe.
So this was a moment of reflection, one could say, a moment of reflection that later on would be lost among the many war crimes that both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia committed. Now, Professor Berendt, in the light of the existing research, do you think it is fair to draw comparisons between the situation that happened back then in the 1930s, the late 1930s, just ahead of World War II, we only got, the taste of things to come with the activities of these 2 regimes, and the situation that we can see today with, once again, a revisionist power emerging and waging a war of aggression against one of its neighbors, and not for the first time. We remember the war in Ukraine started back in 2014. So do you think that the situation, in a way, is somewhat similar to what we have seen back then?
At first, I would like to add something to your first question, what we omitted in our answers. So you asked the question, was it possible to stop the war? And the answer was no. It could start, it started, but we omitted one thing, comparing the potential of the democratic countries like Great Britain, France, United States. The Third Reich could not stand with all these democratic countries acting against the Third Reich. Could not stand. But they did nothing, actually.
A wasted opportunity.
They wasted opportunity. So he could conquer Poland and then in 1940 go further. We can, and the second question, another question. Of course, we can and we should compare. We can discuss issues. For example, comparing what was going on in the Soviet Union the internal policy of Soviet Union and then in the Third Reich. So almost 10 million people were starved or murdered in the Soviet Union already before the 1st of September 1939. This totalitarian regime committed a crime against his own people. And the German National Socialists were mentally, ideologically prepared to do the same, maybe not to their own people, but to other groups for ethnic and racial reasons. And they were looking only for explanation why they could do it. Communists presented their explanation, National Socialists, fascists, the other one. Now, what is doing Mr. Putin? Denazification of the Ukraine. Where are these Nazi followers in the Ukraine? He wants to conquer with his supporters a sovereign country, and it is only a simple artificial explanation for just a pure imperialism of the Russian Federation.
So once again, groundwork is being laid for war crimes and atrocities, and it is happening already. Professor Heinsohn, would you like to add something to this issue?
Western civilization rests on 4 colors. 2 are Jewish, 2 are Greek. The Jewish one, the sanctity of life and monotheism. The Greek, property and monogamy, just one wife for one husband. The 2 systems tried to cut these 4 colors. And the first major killing of Germany against Germans took place side by side with the genocide against Poles in the Intelligenzaktion. This killing was used to develop the gas chambers. They killed handicapped Germans, and they killed German soldiers that in the war, in the aggressive war against Poland, lost all their limbs or legs or 2 eyes or whatever. They were killed. So they started to realize this elimination of the sanctity of life against their own people. They continued by killing the Polish handicapped in the territories they included right away into their empire. So this view is maybe still too optimistic that the Germans would not do it against each other.
So, of course, we know that atrocities begin in the minds of men, in the minds of leaders, but also their followers. Now, having seen all that, having discussed these parallels, and there are many more parallels, in fact, Professor Engels, when you're looking, for example, at what happened in the past, when Stalinist Soviet Union was trying to find an excuse for murdering members of the Polish resistance, essentially comparing them to Nazis, calling them Nazis, Nazi collaborators. Now we see Vladimir Putin doing pretty much exactly the same. So if you were to compare Putin to one of those 2 leaders of the past, Stalin and Hitler, to whom is he more similar? And does it even matter today, this regard?
I'm not sure if a comparison with either of them would really make much sense, but what I would perhaps like to add to these parallels, that is perhaps one further parallel later on and one difference. Of course, both powers are revisionist powers, both are aiming at the more or less complete assimilation of the territory to win. Both play with assimilation, genocide, deportation deportation of people in order to catch more population also, so there's a demographic element also very obviously in there. But there is one big difference, and that difference is, of course, that Nazi Germany was based on a racist ideology, which even wanted to exterminate people who potentially could even support them. If you see, for example, like the Nazis even killed veterans from the First World War if they were only Jewish, and that some of the Jewish people who initially, some of them might even have had some let's say some support for some form of patriotic German expansionism. There were quite some of them were nevertheless also eradicated. So it was essentially a racist component. Whereas, of course, today, in today's Russia and its imperialism, it's not so much about race or even ethnicity. Russia is, of course, an enormous country where we have different religious, ethnic, cultural groups. We have Muslims, we have Christians, we have Buddhists, we have people of Asiatic origin, of Slavic origin, of Finno-Ugrian origin, and so forth. And so this war is not necessarily aimed at transforming everyone into Russian, but in forcing people to submit to the authoritarian ideology of the Kremlin. Once someone submits to the authority before of the Tsar, now of Putin, then somehow he is acceptable within this Russian Mir system somehow. So that is, of course, a big difference in comparison to National Socialist ideology. Another aspect I would perhaps underline, which is another parallel this time, is, of course, the ideological parallel with today. During the Second World War, or at least at the beginning of the Second World War, some conservatives in France, but also even in the UK and so forth, had some sympathies for National Socialist Germany. They thought that against the menace of communism, that somehow what they interpreted as German conservatism, and which they thought they would detect in Hitler, seemed quite positive to them. So many of the much parts of the French collaboration, of the collaboration, is also explained through this mistake, this idea that somehow fascism, National Socialism has a conservative heart. Of course, later on they were shown wrong, but still I see some parallel with today, where we also have quite some conservative intellectuals, parties and so forth in France, in Germany, even in the US, who think that Putin is somehow on the side opposite to modern wokeism, leftist, and that thus he must be on the right side. And that is, of course, a tremendous error, but many of these people commit them.
Indeed, it's a mistaken belief, because one of the main values inherent in conservatism is protecting the life of citizens.
And
now,
property.
Excuse me?
Property.
Yes, exactly. And basically what happens is that right now Putin's Russia is doing everything to destroy and erase the sanctity of life based on a variety of criteria. And of course we could discuss whether the question of ethnicity is indeed less important there or not. There were some signals from the Russian propaganda suggesting that Russification, so turning these people into Russians, would indeed be taking place, and there are such attempts being made. And also the fact that when it comes to the composition of the Russian army right now, there is an excessive number of people from Russia's ethnic minorities being drafted so as not to anger the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And we unfortunately need to, at least for now, suspend our debate on the situation in Ukraine and the parallels between World War II. We will hopefully come back to it, because there's one other issue I would like to discuss relating to the way the West reacted back then and is reacting now. But for the time being, we need to move on to a much more historical portion of this debate. Now, the outbreak of World War II in 1939 showed the remarkable heroism of Polish troops resisting the Nazi German invasion. In the next video, once again prepared by TVP World in conjunction with the Polish National Foundation and forming part of the Unredeemed public awareness campaign, we shall see the crucial moments of resistance and the driving spirit which allowed Poland to fight against the German, but also to retain its identity throughout the years of occupation later on. Let's take a look.
On September the 1st, the opening salvos of the Second World War were heard and felt. Opening shots were fired on the coast at the Polish outpost of Westerplatte. This assault on Poland by Germany was coordinated with Soviet Russia. It was not a total surprise. In a tradition that has lasted since the 18th century, Germany and Soviet Union, heirs to their great empires, had agreed to divide not only Poland but almost the whole of Eastern Europe into spheres of domination. Despite an understanding with Britain and France that they would attack Germany in the West stayed aloof. Meantime, the tiny Polish garrison at Westerplatte held out under point-blank heavy fire from the battleship Schleswig-Holstein's big guns. The Poles were forced to surrender after a week of unbroken bombardment and assault. It was an example of what was to come. Valiant defense, but ultimately retreat.
We will not forget the wounds that Germans inflicted on Poland. We will not forget the suffering of Polish families, and nor will we forget the courage of the resistance.
Polish forces fought with their customary tenacity, in most cases outnumbered greatly by Germans and Russians. Poland chose to fight, but it was left to fight this battle alone.
So at that point in history, Poland did not have allies who were determined enough to help it survive. It did survived the occupation and later on the years of communism that followed after the USSR seized this part of Europe. Still, at that very moment in history, Poland, unfortunately, was alone. Now, Professor Berendt, let's begin with placing an emphasis on the fact that we often talk about legends of valor, determination, and sacrifice. We often talk about the 300 Spartans, for example, and yet there is a much more contemporary example right here in Poland concerning the way a nation can resist to the very last moment. Even from the first days of the war, there were such examples. Less than 200 Polish troops defending themselves against the Nazi German onslaught. So what does it teach us about the Polish spirit in those first days of the conflict?
So fortunately, during first year and later of the Second World War and German occupation, we had military and political leaders trained in activity already before the First World War. Władysław Raczkiewicz, Prime Minister Sikorski, and generals, they started their career during the First World War. They were able to give their lives for freedom of Poland and independence of Poland. And during the interwar period, these people and teachers were able to spread the values of independent Poland among hundreds of thousands of co-citizens. And these hundreds of thousands of co-citizens did not surrender. They had to accept at the beginning not a total capitulation, but the failure of Polish defense. But they waited for a proper moment to stand up again and to fight. So eventually we had several hundred people in underground organization ready to fight. At least in the home army, about 400,000 people in the fourth year of the German occupation, after murdering several million Polish citizens, about half of them because they were Jewish, another because they belong, as Professor mentioned, to Polish elite. Representatives of Polish elite were being exterminated from the very first weeks of the war, both by German and Soviet side. Still, these people who stayed alive were fighting for freedom. There was a spirit among the elite that survived the collapse of autumn 1939.
Very much so, and the war later on kept dragging on for years, and of course there were many more casualties. The Polish Home Army, as you've mentioned, probably the biggest resistance movement of its kind during the entire conflict. Now, Professor Heinsohn, it is often said that Poland and the Poles exhibit a certain romanticism, a romantic spirit that allowed them to fight, but that proved to be, as the critics say, unrealistic. In many cases, there were uprisings which ended up being militarily unsuccessful, while of course carrying on this spirit of resistance onwards. However, let me ask you the following question. Isn't it the case that if everyone in Poland was a realist, not even that would have been possible? And also, if Ukraine did not exhibit the very same kind of romanticism, then it possibly might have already fallen before the armies of Vladimir Putin. So once again, does the world today need a certain degree of romanticism and relying on moral values rather than simply political realism?
As it happened, my father started the war with a few other men. He was artillery officer on the battleship Schlesien that did not attack Westerplatte but Hel. And I obtained the documents of the negotiations between my father's boss, Admiral Schmund, and the Polish Navy chief, Admiral Unruh, a German by origin von Unruh. And I will tell you a story about the cunning of the Poles. These two officers, they dealt each other with honor under the laws of war, whilst at the same time the SS was doing the genocide. And Schmund promised Unruh that his officers could leave with their weapons and all their medals. But he asked Unruh one favor. He said, "You have very modern 15-centimeter guns in Hel, and I want to make sure that they get clean and intact into our hands." So when the Germans moved into Hel, these cannons were destroyed. And Unruh was faced with that, and he said, "I don't understand it. Already in the evening, I went with my simple soldiers from every gun and told them, you must keep this gun intact, and they just did not follow my orders."
So that is a truly fascinating story. Professor Engels, about the romantic attitude of the Poles, do you think that it was a feature of character, a trait that proved instrumental to Poland's ultimate victory in the fight for freedom, a victory that wouldn't come until many, many years later when communism collapsed? Or is it true that what the critics say, that more realism would have been in order? What do you think? Because it often appears time and time again that, you know, this sort of criticism of the attitude that Poles have exhibited throughout the years and even centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cynicism is always the characteristics of a late civilization. It's only when civilizations grow old that they think, well, mourir pour Danzig, like the French said when they didn't want really to interact or to enter the war. And that is very typical for that kind of thing. If you look already at classical antiquity, we see this enormous difference between the classical period where, for example, the city of Athens, together with some few Greek cities, decided to withstand the invasion by the enormous Achaemenid Empire, where hundreds of thousands of people in this enormous multicultural army tried to annex Greece, and where some Greek cities remained independent and wanted to fight this Persian army, and in the end succeeded. If we compare that with some centuries later, when the Romans and others tried to conquer Greece with much less forces and most cities simply surrendered because exactly they said the same thing. Well, it isn't worth the while, it will just cost us many lives. It's much better to be part of an enormous empire and to have all these economic advantages, let's see later, and so forth. And so the same happened, of course, also with the situation in the Second World War. And I'm quite convinced that it was also probably the intact honor and courage of Poland after the Second World War that made things like Solidarność possible later on, whereas perhaps other nations who didn't have the courage really to withstand invasion by foreign armies were so broken also by their own cowardice, and then of course also by the use of under communism of breaking personalities and states and identities and humiliating them, that later on they were even incapable of resisting. So this is certainly the intact honor of the Polish army, of the Polish people, and their continued fight made it possible also later on for them to free themselves of communism many years later. And of course it is only in a state or society where everyone, in case of necessity, is ready to take up arms and to defend one's own honor, one's own duty, one's family, one's religion, one's state, that attacks and invasions like that of Nazi Germany or that of many other states is simply not possible, because they wouldn't even dare enter that kind of war. So that is an absolutely important example which the West should remember much more than it does now, because the West, we'll speak about that later I suppose, is absolutely unaware of Polish history and of whatever happened here in the east of the European Union.
But you create...
This is a crucial moment, the crucial moment in history that you've mentioned, that despite the attempts to break the Polish spirit, Poles kept fighting on. But there is also another thing that connects the Soviet system and the Nazi system, the attempts to decapitate a nation by destroying its elites. And one of these attempts that I would like to talk about now, it came it came later during the war, after, of course, Poland was stabbed in the back by the Soviet Union a few weeks after Nazi Germany attacked, eliminating any chance of being able to conduct successful defense operations. But we need to move a bit forward to a moment that defined the modern meaning of genocide, one of the defining moments. Now, Professor Heinsohn, the Katyń massacre, Polish officers murdered by the Soviet Union in the Katyń forest. Can you tell us how important is it to think about those events today? What meaning do they have? And also, how important is it that the Soviet Union has for many years denied its involvement in this war crime?
Katyń is the first genocide. Remember, the term was created 44, Katyń was 40. Katyń is the first genocide that was researched very carefully, very finely, by another genocidal power, by Germany. So we have the report on the genocide of Poles by Russians, as we never had a report on genocide before, or on mass murder before in the history of mankind. The Germans did this report. And in the Nuremberg trials, when the chief Russian prosecutor accused Germany of Katyń, even Göring, who was soon to be condemned to death, could not stop laughing. And the Russians dropped the case. And now we have an important difference at the end of the war, between Germany and Russia. Germans were punished. Germans slowly confessed to their crimes. Every German today will know about the Holocaust, not about the genocide against the Poles. And you have seen in the movie our president, he did not do what no president of Germany did do so far. Nobody came to Poland and said, we take the responsibility for the Holocaust. But we also must confess that our first genocide was directed against the Polish people 22 months before the Holocaust had begun. Back to Katyn. Russia was not punished. Russia was never punished. And that's why today, even today, the Russians feel that they're unbeatable and unpunishable, and that they can commit crimes without ever being persecuted for that. The Germans, and in the wake of the Germans' confession, all the Western society, they are digging into their past and look for their crimes. Russia did not do this. A very brief period under Yeltsin, Russia did not do this. And let's not forget that Putin has given the name of his idol, not Stalin, not Lenin. He hates Lenin. His idol is Antony Denikin, the commanding general of the Tsarist forces against the Bolsheviks. Every Bolshevik, and Putin was educated as a Bolshevik, learned that Denikin was the devil. The devil is his idol. He took the remains of Denikin. He was buried in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He took them to the Donskoy monastery in 2007 and asked the Russian journalists, have you read the diaries of Denikin? What does he write? He writes, nobody has the right to interfere between Russia and Ukraine. That's our personal, our only responsibility, and we will go against anybody who tries to interfere. That's Putin's idol.
We are trying,
it's a very ominous warning.
Real parallel between the situation in the past and Germany, Soviet Russia, and other countries. We cannot forget that the Soviets covered with silence not only the Katyn crime, they covered with silence all other crimes committed after the so-called October Revolution. All these 10 million people and people murdered and deported during the Second World War and after this were issues omitted in Soviet Russia. So for us, it is important. 22,000 representatives of Polish officers, police officers, leaders of the society.
The very best we had to offer.
Yes.
They lost their lives because
but it was
the Soviet Union wanted to destroy
part
our
of
elites.
this total crime committed in the Soviet Union. So, and it all was silence for many decades.
Yes.
So
one more word on the Polish soldier. If you ask a German about the Polish army, what will he answer? We defeated the army in a few weeks. The Germans don't know that the Polish contingents were active in the invasion at the Normandy and were part of the army that defeated Germany. No German has an idea that Poles helped to defeat Germany, that had their own port in Wilhelmshaven, their own area of command. It's basically unknown, and it shows how bad-mouthing the Polish military spirit continues to this very day. You see that you cannot speak about this in Germany, whereas here in the country you have in every city you have a street for any of the battles the Poles fought against the Germans.
So nevertheless, one can say that,
which is a fruit of Nazi propaganda also, because it's interesting that during the first weeks of the war, the Germans couldn't hide that they had big losses and that the Poles fought valiantly. So in the first Wochenschau, they insist still somehow, at least for the German public, on the chivalric side of the war and on the great exploits of the German troops against the valiant Polish army. And very quickly, some weeks later, after the defeat, when it is about not anymore, when it's about assimilating and really destroying Polish state. No, of course, this began the first day, but when it became clear that this war would drag on and that it would also concern France and Great Britain, and that later on it would also be directed towards the Soviet Union, then slowly the propaganda shifted and the Germans tried to present their victory as being a victory victory over a more or less insignificant army which they fought in just some weeks, because on the one hand they wanted to present the Poles as some form of Untermenschen who were not even valuable enemies, and later on of course also diminish the fear what would happen with a conflict with the Soviet Union. So we are still now somehow, or Germany especially, somehow the victim somehow of Nazi German representation also of the true nature of the war here in Poland.
So that was another trait that was common to the two totalitarian regimes, the vilification of its opponents, something that was very much in line with both ideologies, albeit, of course, based on different premises. Now, Professor Berendt, do you think it is safe to say that while Germany has at least begun this sort of redemption arc of its own, with the gradual, one could say, expulsion of the very vestiges of Nazi ideology from society, nobody today will openly glorify Adolf Hitler in Germany, besides some fringe movements, which of course do exist, but nobody holding an official position within the state would ever dare to say that there was anything even remotely positive, even remotely beneficial about what Adolf Hitler did. Now, in Russia, it is totally different. There is no search of redemption whatsoever. And in fact, the current leadership, Putin's Russia, is incorporating and glorifying the most vile examples of war crimes and of what the successive leaders of the Soviet Union did throughout the years, including Joseph Stalin. So why is this so? Is it merely because in the end Stalin did sit at the table deciding on the future of Europe while Germany did not? Or is it also the case that subsequent circumstances within our societies, especially in the West, made it impossible to essentially show that there was an equation between Nazi Germany, the Nazi system, and the Soviet system, because communist parties were so prevalent that they would always defend that and say, you cannot compare these two things. Communism is all about ideals, and perhaps there were mistakes, but it still is something glorious, something to be spoken in positive terms. Whereas, in fact, of course, both of these regimes began with genocide and would often follow this very path.
So, in Germany, in my opinion, a lesson was learned, and the mainstream of the political life is created by people who learned this lesson of the Nazi time. No war again, no totalitarian regime again. But there was condemning of the Nazi regime in the occupied Germany, and also during in both German states after 1939. In the Soviet Union and in Russia, there was no Nuremberg trial for communist perpetrators. And with only this relatively short time gap of Yeltsin, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. So when people could talk freely about crimes of the past of 1920s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, Vladimir Putin wants to rebuild the empire, and maybe because of his origin as a KGB officer. Look, in the internet we have thousands of Russian present movies, and please try to check what is the picture of NKVD, Cheka and KGB officers. They are heroes. They are heroes who defended the homeland against the Nazi Third Reich, they helped a lot to save the state and the nation. Almost no information about mass crimes committed by these people. And it is a present movie system, a present movie story created in that country. So taking from the mass culture, present mass culture, Russian mass culture, people less and less cannot get more information, actual information about the past. In Germany, it is impossible to learn the fairy tale about the Nazi time. In present Russia, under Putin, with 140 million people, every day learned a fairy tale about the past of the Soviet Union.
It is an obligatory narrative that is being pushed upon society, plunging Russia deeper and deeper into its dark past. Now, we shall move on to the final part of our discussion, which once again deals with issues of redemption, atonement, and justice. And this time around, it is going to be about the rather controversial question of war reparations. War reparations which Nazi Germany was forced to pay. Germany, in fact, following the collapse, of course, of the Nazi regime. But it did not do so with respect to all countries involved in the war. Not all victims, in effect, have managed to feel that they got the justice they deserved. So let us take a look at the third video prepared by TVP World in cooperation with the Polish National Foundation, forming part of the Unredeemed public awareness campaign.
Years of war, murder, looting, and planned destruction. What did all this cost? It's a number on a piece of paper. Whatever the currency, it amounts to billions. Homes destroyed and plundered, factories demolished, cultural monuments, buildings and artifacts vandalized or looted. Warsaw, sacked, leveled, and emptied of its material and human history. One of the greatest European cities suffered particularly during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944.
For 63 days, Polish men, women, and children struggled against the Nazis. For 63 days, they faced the tanks, machine guns, and bombers with courage and faith and solidarity.
Behind each brick or stone demolished, there is a life murdered, unfulfilled, maimed or exiled. Poland lost around 6 million of its citizens. The question of reparations is still a live one, to Poland at least.
I bow sorrowfully before the suffering of the victims. I ask for forgiveness for Germany's historical guilt.
After 1945, it became woven into the machinations of Cold War power politics. The Marshall Plan was designed to restore shattered Europe to its former economic significance. Offered to all of Europe at a cost of $13 billion at the time, it was adopted by Western European countries, since those under communist rule were pressurized to withdraw. Communist Poland was pressured by the Soviet Union to waive its claims. It would not take advantage of the Marshall Plan. Other countries received generous settlements from Western Germany. Poland was excluded. The bill for Poland's wartime losses is still outstanding and amounts to $1,532,170,000,000.
A truly massive amount there, and that's just the losses inflicted upon Poland by Nazi Germany. The question of how much Poland lost, both through the fact that, once again, looting, the killing of Poland's citizens, and also the lost opportunities for development from the invasion and subsequent subjugation by the Soviet Union, the incorporation into the Soviet system. This is another question entirely. How much Poland lost through this. But whatever we say about this, one could say that the question of justice still hangs there in the air. For the Poles, very much something that they would like to see resolved. Now, Professor Heinsohn, from your perspective, why isn't Germany taking the opportunity to finally lay the demons of the past to rest, to essentially cross that one final item on the list, the very first country that was attacked by Nazi Germany, that suffered unbelievable war crimes at the hands of Adolf Hitler and his armies? And yet, it seems like even mentioning the topic of war reparations strikes a nerve among the German elites. Germany, a modern society with a thriving democratic society, but there is still this shadow of the past that's hanging above it all. What do you think? Why is that so?
The first time reparations were paid to Poland was around 2000, and it was achieved by my assistant at the Raphael Lemkin Institute at Bremen, Klaus von Münchhausen. He died last year of COVID, and against odds that meant that everybody told him, you will never ever manage. He managed the right of every citizen in the world to go to court against the German government. Before, only government could go against government, and Klaus was the person that enabled the forced laborers, most of them were Polish, eventually to get, not that much, but not zero, reparation and reconstitution. So it shows, we are talking the year 2000, how long this took just for this small reparation, a few billion, in that time still Deutschmark. If you look at the sum of 1.5 trillion, it doesn't shock me that much anymore, because the European Union, for every minor or major problem, throws out 700 billion or 800 billion, or the Americans, they throw out 3 billion or 5 billion just for the local or national politics. But when I look at the realization to obtain this sum from Germany, I remember the hostility, the hatred we received, especially Klaus von Münchhausen. I was just his boss, but so I received less of the hatred when we tried to obtain some money for the Polish forced laborers. And of course, the way the Germans look at it is, yeah, it's true, but we lost 130 cities. They were flattened like Warsaw. 130 German cities were flattened like Warsaw, and now we are the great-grandchildren. And they will be very reluctant to think about it. That's why I proposed, when the idea came up, that the Germans don't know that their first genocide was against Poland. And they have a sense of honor, and they will think about it. And I proposed, let's ask Germany a fund, let's say 5 billion euros, and use this fund for the research and the personal restitution for the Poles that were killed in Intelligenzaktionen, in AB-Aktionen. This was never done. You see, many other survivors of genocidal victims of Germany's, even great-grandchildren, they received money from Germany. And I think this could also be considered for Poland. And I assume these 5 billion will be obtained quite easily. The 1,500 billion will be more complicated.
So now, Professor Engels, if it only was about the German government, the German political elites simply refusing to pay any reparations to anyone throughout the years, but this was not the case. In fact, some countries have been receiving reparations throughout the years. For example, Germany has acknowledged crimes committed against the people of Namibia much earlier than that. So this was, once again, something that one could say was so long ago that it was almost forgotten forgotten, and yet Germany decided that it should redress those wrongs. So when Poland, it seems very much like this is an exception to the rule here, that Poland somehow has been excluded from this process of reconciliation. So let's begin with the moral side of things, the ethics. What signal does it send in this day and age when we often say, well, all such wrongs need to be redressed at some point?
Well, I will say probably some very evil things now, but the reparations paid to Namibia, for example, are much more acceptable by the broader public because this is also intertwined with the racial issues of today, about the idea of critical whiteness theory, and so from that point of view, of course, it is much more fashionable, let's say, within the German public than talking about Poland. The other problem, of course, is that Poland in the German media, and not only the German media, is represented under a very negative point of view because also of this tireless bashing of the current Polish government. And so it is really clear that the German government will never pay any, let's say, substantial sum to the current conservative government. This is simply a question of political hostility. They would only be able or willing probably to pay reparations to a leftist liberal government, which will probably refuse the reception of it. So this is also a political issue which is also linked to the German mindset, which is now thoroughly convinced of having done such a work on one's own crimes of the past that by now this is somehow absolved, or at least that the concrete gestion of these issues is somehow a thing of the past. So they gladly take over their moral responsibility. But speaking about now concrete paying back things for Poland, that is of course something very different. Even more so, as Professor Heinsohn also already insisted upon, that the genocide against the Polish nation from the first day of the war on is absolutely unknown in Germany. It is anyway unknown in France and in Belgium, so nobody knows about all that. But in Germany too, people associate, and despite their school education focusing on the Third Reich and so forth, but they essentially associate the war in the East with the Holocaust against the Jews and the war against the Soviet Union, which is somehow conflicted or contracted with the war against Russia, where Ukraine doesn't even exist in. And that it was from the beginning on a war against the Polish people as such, with the wish of exterminate the Polish elite and intelligentsia from day one. This is not yet known in Germany. And so they think, well, but we are always talking about the Holocaust, and we always are flagellating ourselves even 3 generations afterward. So for us, this is more or less finished. We take over moral responsibility, but no concrete action, because they do not even know it, and somehow I think that they wouldn't probably really want to know it. And one of the, as a last point, one of the few political parties probably more open, let's say, to these issues, like the Greens or also the SPD or even Linke, of course, their political wish is also expressed in the fact that they say, yeah, we are willing to reimburse parts of our war crimes, but only in financing cultural projects and artistic projects, probably focusing on LGBTQ issues or interreligious tolerance or that kind of thing. So that is even the case now, that in Germany the few parties willing probably to reimburse Poland would also like to use that in order also to have some form of ideological fashioning of the current Polish mindset, which is also a certain risk. So that's more or less the situation, which is very complicated, and I can't really see how we will overcome this paradoxical and tragic situation.
But apart from the political context, which you've mentioned is quite complicated, I'm glad that you referred to the question of Germany and Russia, because there was an argument raised recently with respect to economic cooperation that Germany owes Russia for World War II, and therefore it needs to maintain economic cooperation. This was used, I think, with reference to the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, which does indeed sound quite hypocritical. Now, Professor Berendt, what would need to happen in order for any sort of settlement, any sort of agreement, perhaps not for the entire sum, perhaps something lower, symbolic even, but still substantial, for such a deal to be made between Poland and Germany? From a political standpoint, do you think it is even possible today?
So, but please ask this question not to us. Historian scientists ask politicians about the issue. I can only explain why there is no public support in Germany for this. Both colleagues mention the reason, because 80 million German citizens have almost no knowledge about what was going on in Eastern Europe with Polish people, Ukrainian people, Belarusian people during the Second World War. You will not find information about crimes committed against Gentile, Ukrainian, Polish, Belarusian people in class books. And you will not find such information, for example, in, on the other hand, very interesting film, Kriegs- und Holocaust, made by ZDF. There is no specific number of victims of Gentile people in Poland, although this film was produced only 2 years ago. 2 years ago. No knowledge, so no public support, for a reason mentioned by Professor. And maybe I will mention also one aspect. Don't forget that there was about 60,000 Herero people murdered during these 3 years at the beginning of the 20th century. Maybe it was easier to pay 1 billion euro for this crime when to buy this $1.5 trillion for millions of people murdered in Eastern Europe. It is a reason for politicians or for government. And I do not know in what way to get this money from Germany. But you must you should invite politicians to look for the solution.
Now, Professor Heinsohn, do you think that it also has to do with not just the question of public awareness, also, and this is also emphasized by the fact that indeed there doesn't seem to be the same amount of stigma, one could say, in the public view attached to what happened to Poles than, say, what happened during the Holocaust. Of course, there is no denying the gravity of the Holocaust as a crime against humanity, and that needs to be emphasized, needs to be said that this is something that will still stand in the history books as the most horrific moment in history. However, when you're thinking about situations, for example, in which one could say, well, let's do something in order to express our shame, our feeling of responsibility, there are often these small opportunities. Poland has donated tanks to Ukraine, and there were talks concerning the backfill with German tanks, and these talks apparently have collapsed. Now, do you think that if Germany, the German elites, felt the need to somehow compensate Poland for what was done, not to the full amount of over 1 trillion, but if there still was this feeling of responsibility, they perhaps should have said, well, we're donating a large number of these state-of-the-art tanks because we know that in these dramatic times, the crimes of the past need to be redressed somehow. And we're helping you, you're helping Ukraine, and this is a very powerful signal. But this opportunity apparently was wasted. Do you think it has to do with the way the German society still doesn't appreciate what happened back then in 1939 and beyond?
The Hitler regime wanted to kill or expel 100 million Slavs up to the Ural Mountains. 100 million Slavs. If you ask a German, he would, what are you talking about? I will answer Generalplan Ost. These 100 million were to be replaced by 15 million young German farmer couples. And they would work the surviving Slavs to death to put the infrastructure for their 15 million farms in the ground. This is not known at all. So before there is a conscience of what was planned and enough was realized, the debate is difficult. And let's not forget, the pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, were in hostile act from the beginning against Poland. The German companies that bought gas from Russia, they demanded another pipeline through Poland, parallel to the Yamal pipeline. They demanded another pipeline through Ukraine. And they were happy with it. And the Ukrainians were happy with it, and the Poles were happy with it because the Poles earned money with Yamal pipeline. Putin was not happy. Yeltsin was happy with it. Kohl was happy with it. Putin not. Putin forced the boss of Gazprom to publicly promise, he did this 2000, never to build a pipeline through Ukraine or Poland. Still, he was fired in 2001, and he was replaced by a person, Alexei Miller, with connections to the Russian mafia. And this Miller, boss of Gazprom in 2001, gave a job to Schröder in 2005. And it was Schröder who forced the German companies to forget about their profit motive and say, we make nothing through Poland, nothing through Ukraine. And we learn that the German companies, they were seduced to follow Schröder and Putin by gaining business parts in the Russian petroleum, not gas, in the petroleum industry. So this was a conspiracy from the beginning. It's not well known. And this conspiracy has a very clean way to recognize. So when the business deal, another pipeline to Poland, another to Ukraine, was dropped by Putin and by Schröder, other European leaders were against it, but only Germany counted. And Schröder did it. When they stopped the business and say, now it's something that it's against Poland and it's a Russian-German alliance thing, they decided always to say, it's just a private sector business. We have no influence on it at all. The moment it was no longer a private business, they used this terminology. And Scholz, our chancellor now, he did this in December last year against the protests of other European leaders. He said it's just a private business. He had forgotten that Merkel in 2018 had publicly confessed that it is a political project. And that was code, political project was code a project against Poland and Ukraine.
Which brings us back to the very beginning of our conversation in a way. Professor Berendt, do you think that there is still, at least among the elites in Germany, this sort of, one could say, perhaps not a common trait. One could call it a preconception that cooperation with Russia is the way forward. After all, one could begin to wonder, how was it possible for the German Chancellor to ultimately have accepted the interests of the Russian state above the interest of his own state, as was already said. Later on, he was hired by a Russian company. Why do you think also the German society has accepted this state of affairs, which of course right now it is much more open to criticism in the German media, as is the conduct and the decisions of Mr. Scholz? But before that, it just seems to have essentially flown under the radar. It was not really that much discussed. It wasn't considered that much of a big deal. So do you think this is because there is still this age-old tradition of cooperation between Germany and Russia, which has survived into the business realm, if not into the military one, or is it something else?
So such a kind of cooperation existed already during the Soviet Union. When we think about cooperation between democratic Germany and the Soviet Union in 1970s, with this first pipelines going from the east to the west. So in a way, democratic world helped Soviet regime to survive 1970s and 1980s. So it is not only a question of cooperation in 1930s. It is also a question of 1970s and 1980s. It is difficult to comprehend why such politicians as Chancellor Merkel or Scholz supports these ideas with such an explanation. Why Chancellor Schroeder does it, we understand, for obvious reasons. Why these two other persons, I cannot comprehend. Really, Professor will say yes or no. To some extent, I was thinking that as an expression of a kind of arrogance that we are so influential, so wise, that we will create the reality according to our way of thinking. We will build these pipelines, we will support our economy with cheap oil, with cheap ice, we will, with this cheap energy resources, we'll have more competitive economy to develop better than other countries, quicker than other countries.
It's more serious, I think, because these pipelines below the Baltic Sea are not profitable. The pipeline through, another pipeline through Poland would be much cheaper. And Gazprom was against it because Gazprom thought it's much too expensive to go under the sea. Let's do what we did before. There's more to it. There is, if I may put it in a maybe funny way, the two world wars, there were Saxon civil wars, German Saxons against Anglo-Saxons. And the German Saxons lost twice, and the Anglo-Saxons won twice. And since then, there is this dream that the German Saxons will show it, the Anglo-Saxons, one day. And this show, the Anglo-Saxons, you may defeat us, and you have defeated us, but we still have this option to go with Russia. This dream never stopped.
So this is a very interesting perspective there. Now, Professor Engels, do you think that right now, given what happened in Ukraine and given the gradual changes taking place within this debate, the concept known as Wandel durch Handel is now dead and buried, and that Germany will have to change its ways?
It's of course difficult to say how this will evolve in the future. I see that at least in Germany there's one positive thing linked to the almost total control of the media by the green and left somehow, statistically also very obvious. That is of course their hostility towards Russia from that point of view and their wish to support Ukraine. So for the first time we see that the media are quite in opposition to the government. Under Merkel, they were more or less on the same side. Now, somehow, the media struggle with Scholz' obvious delaying of delivering weapons and so forth. So there is a certain pressure, at least from the media, also to be more straightforward with supporting Ukraine. Of course, that is also somehow a cover-up of the disaster of the green leftist climate and energy politics, because it is precisely because of the pressure by leftism.
Precisely. We are unfortunately drawing slowly to the end of our debates. Now, can I ask you for a short 1-minute summary of what do you think the future of Europe will be given all these circumstances? Professor Engels, let's begin.
Yeah, so I think that the war is the inauguration of a long period of trouble. War, violence, the non-respect of treaties, all that will become much more endemic. The economic crisis, which already started long before the Ukrainian war, will become much and more endemic. Europe, I think, will go into, at least Western Europe, will go into a prolonged economic decline, and there might be very nasty consequences of that. We see that already in France, where the Yellow Vest movement was only the beginning of something. So there might be enormous political upheavals in France, perhaps even soon in Italy coming forth. And so the political chessboard in Europe might change very strongly, but not definitely.
Turbulent period, all in all.
Very turbulent period.
Professor Berendt, do you think that we're just facing a moment of instability, or could it actually deteriorate into something much, much worse?
There is such a danger, because we really do not know what Vladimir Putin is able to do further, trying to win the war. In Ukraine, there are hundreds of thousands of brave people ready to fight for their country. They need support, financial and military support. If democratic world can unify supporting Ukrainian, they will defend their territory. They do not want to conquer Russia. They simply want to regain their territory and to make their home safe. I really cannot tell what this man from Kremlin is able to do, for example, with nuclear weaponry.
So, Professor Heinsohn, finally, Russia has shown many weaknesses in military terms. Ukraine is fighting bravely for its freedom. Do you think the West will rise up to the challenge and help Ukraine sufficiently to allow it to win the war and expel the aggressors once and for all?
In 1914, out of 100 military-age men, 36 were Europeans. 36 out of 100 in the entire world. Today, 6. Today, 6. A median age of these nations of 42. Germany fell by income back to 2014. If Germany is no longer rated AAA by the rating agencies, the moment Germany is no longer rated AAA, the European Union will collapse, because every major bank and every major company has German state debt in their equity. And if the German degradation comes, then all these treasures in the equities of the banks and the companies will be devalued. So the euro will drop, and for this situation, everybody has to be prepared. And that's why I think that the northern and the eastern rim from Iceland, British Scandinavia, Poland, Baltic Poland, Czech maybe, they have to prepare to build an alliance that is defensible, and it's only defensible if
so preparing for the future,
if you have the British
approach.
If you have the British nuclear power in it, you don't
Very
want
much
to.
so. And unfortunately, we do have to finish our debate right now. Professor Gunnar Heinsohn, Professor Grzegorz Berendt, and Professor David Engels, thank you very much for joining us here today during this very important debate on the 83rd anniversary of the outbreak of World War II. I'm Jan Ślewiński, and you've been watching TVP World, a special debate concerning the past, the history, but also the future of Europe in the wake of what happened all those years ago in 1939 when Nazi Germany and then Soviet Russia attacked Poland. Thank you very much for watching.